All right, we're going to get started. I want to thank you all for coming again this week. We're very lucky to have Dr. Diane Brentari from the University of Chicago. She is the, and I have to write this down, it's a nice long name, the Mary K. Workman Professor of Linguistics at the University of Chicago, and the Director for the Center, or of the Center for Study of Gesture, Sign, and Language, and a author on numerous publications, papers, journal articles, etc. And we're so happy to have her coming today, and we'll get started. There are a few extra chairs up front, and if you want to pull in chairs from the hallway, you can do that as well, or if you're comfortable sitting where you are. Not just you, everybody. All right, thanks so much.
Well, I'm very happy to be here this afternoon. It's a joy to see this new building and to be here on such a splendid February day in the Northeast. So today I'm going to be talking about typology in sign languages and asking whether typological categories can be as useful in sign language studies as they are for spoken language. And we start with a very famous professor from Stanford, Joseph Greenberg, who was one of the grandfathers of typology. And he was able to articulate for spoken languages some important, as it were, implicational universals. And don't get all nervous about the word universals. It doesn't mean that it is exceptionless. It just means that he could articulate these statements of the form, if a language has X, then it also has Y. So here were a couple of those for spoken languages. So if a language happens to have gender distinctions in plural forms, then it means that it also will have gender distinctions in singular forms. If, and he was restricting his studies to spoken languages, if a spoken language has stems or morphemes that are split up, where piece happens in one part of the word and another piece happens in another part of the word, if a language has those kinds of morphemes, then definitely it also would have the kind where you have suffixes and prefixes, where all of the form comes together. And a language with a dominant order of verb, subject, object tends to be predominantly prepositional rather than postpositional. The details of these implicational universals don't matter so much, but the point is simply that he was trying to show us that characteristics of language sometimes travel together. And if you know one thing, you can predict other things, even if you haven't studied those other things. If you know from previous studies of other languages that all of these characteristics kind of hang together in an affiliated fashion, when you go to a new language and you find that one of these things is true, you might also expect that the other things are true as well. And that's the sort of approach I want to find out is useful for sign languages. And so languages work with the material that they have at their disposal. And in sign languages, one of the very, very sort of fundamental parts of word building is the handshake of the sign. And so today we're going to be talking about two different kinds of handshakes. There are lots of different kinds, but for this talk there are just two. And the one type are the handling handshakes. And these handshakes basically capture in the representation the way that you manipulate or interact with objects. And you can see that in the two examples here, as you would pick up a small object, and you would use a very fine pincer grasp, or screw in a light bulb, and you would have a round, bulbous object that you're handling. And these handshakes, the representation of the hand is the hand. And so it's got hand as hand iconicity. And they'll be abbreviated as HHS in all of the rest of the slides. The other kind of handshake is the group called object handshakes. And these have different kind of iconicity because the hand is actually representing some physical properties of the object itself, not how you handle it, but what it looks like typically. So flat objects might have a handshake like this, so sign like book. Or a round object might have a handshake like this, like a coin. So it captures the dimensions of the object with a hand. And they're going to be abbreviated OHS in the rest of the talk. Now, in terms of typology and these two different types of handshakes, we saw a couple of studies that are sort of foundational in this domain. So Carol Padden and her colleagues did an early study, early 2009 recent study of the handshake preferences that sign languages might have when referring to nouns that are tools. So basically tools that are nouns. And she found from a range of 6 sign languages that they clustered into 2 groups. One group tended to use object handshakes for representing tools. So things like comb, where it's the tongs, toothbrush, where it's the long thin object, screwdriver, where it's the shape of the screwdriver, etc. Instead of the handling handshake. So American Sign Language, Swedish Sign Language, and Danish Sign Language were object handshake preference forms. She called them instrument handshake preference, but for our purposes today, object handshake is fine. And in contrast, Japanese, British, and New Zealand Sign Language had a preference for using handling handshakes for these same forms. So instead of showing a comb with the tongs, it would show the comb the way you handle the comb, the way you hold the toothbrush, and the way you hold the screwdriver. So the 2 different types of sign languages were quite apparent. And she found, interestingly, that the historical depth of the language didn't really matter so much. So Al Said Bedouin Sign Language, which is a very new sign language, which is only about 75 years old, had a preference for object handshakes in these tool forms, just the way ASL did, which is 350 years old. And New Zealand Sign Language is about half the age, between the 2 ages, about 150 years old. And it had the handling preference, the handling handshake preference. So it didn't seem like historical depth was going to help us see to say languages were changing from handling preference to object preference or vice versa. And what was interesting is that she collected data from a lot more sign languages than she reported in these publications. And she found that there were quite a few sign languages that fell into what she called the mixed category. They weren't clearly object handshake languages, and they weren't clearly handling handshake languages. And she wasn't sure what to do with them. And so from that these leftover languages that we couldn't explain, I was inspired to do the work that I'm going to be presenting today. I'm going to be arguing that these preferences for different kinds of iconic handshakes, the handling and the object handshake preference, is modulated by the way that the sign languages handle instrumental arguments, the way that they handle the grammatical object of instrument. And I'm going to be looking at 3 different kinds of data to answer this question. Iconicity will continue to be important, but that there are these other factors as well. So the first set of forms come from the part of the lexicon. What you see here is, in fact, a schematic of the native vocabulary items in a sign language. And what you see is a white circle and a gray circle. In the core lexical items, these are the ones you might find in a dictionary, like know and think and please and sorry. words that you can just look up in the dictionary. The spatial lexicon contains polymorphemic forms. That means that they're put together by meaningful pieces. The handshake means something, the movement means something, sometimes the location also means something. And then notice that there's a place where they overlap. So the first forms that we'll be examining are in the spatial lexicon, and these are forms that are called classifier predicates, which have these polycomponential meanings. And typically these classifier predicates are articulated in neutral space. And what's interesting about them is that they're verbs of motion and location. That's how they were originally defined, and that's how I'm going to define them here today. They're not verbs of interacting with objects. They're, move the pencil. The vehicle went from point A to point B. So they're very generic, locative kinds of verbs. So that's the first set of data. And I'm going to show you an example now of one way that these handshakes that I referred to, the handling and object handshakes, are important in classifier predicates. So here you see a verb phrase describing a lollipop that's just upside down on a table on the left. Nobody's touching it. There's nobody moving it. It's just the object in that location. And you see it's using an object handshake, the long, thin stem of the lollipop. The one on the right is somebody manipulating a lollipop to put it upside down. And you see that it has a handling handshake. So over the course of the last decade, there's been a lot of work done showing that this non-agentive, agentive distinction using object handshakes when you have no agent in the clause and handling handshakes when you have an agent in the clause is very robust, particularly in these classifier predicates that are polycomponential. The second set of data, and the third actually, come from this part that's kind of overlapping, where you can see it's gray, but it's also overlapping with the core. These forms are, the handshakes are handling and object handshakes, and they're still iconic, but they're not morphological. And we know they're not morphological from a bunch of tests that have been developed over the years about how they behave in terms of derivational morphology, changing nouns from verbs, for example. And so in this category, there are two sets of forms that are going to be of interest to us. One is what I'm going to call act-on verbs. And these are verbs that show the typical way that you engage with objects. And the movements, unlike the movements of classifier predicates, they're not locatives. They're not just move and be at kinds of verbs. They're verbs like comb and screw in and pick up and brush and all kinds of interactive kind of predicates. And these are agentive also. There are two kinds of these act-on predicates. Some of them are verbs that act on a direct object, like put on your shoes, put on your socks, put on your jacket, eat an apple. Here we see an example, apple, eat the apple. And so you interact with the apple as a direct object. And that is one type of these act-on verbs. The other kind are also engaging act-on verbs, but they are engaging with objects vis-a-vis an instrumental. And you can imagine eating an apple with a fork. So you might say something like apple, in which case no longer are you interacting with the apple pieces with your hands, you're interacting with them vis-a-vis an instrument. So they're in some ways a three-place predicate instead of a two-place predicate. a subject and an object, a direct object, in the ones without an instrument, and a three-place predicate in the ones with an instrument. And here we see a contrast in two forms in ASL that take advantage of this contrast. So on the left-hand side, you see someone closing a box with tape. And you can see that, yes, you're closing the box, person closing box, but you're doing it vis-a-vis the tape, and the tape gets the object handshake. And the one on the right, the example on the right, is eating a lollipop, where you're directly engaging with the lollipop and bringing it to your mouth with a handling handshake. So the instrumental cases tend to use object handshakes, and the non-instrumental ones with the direct objects tend to use the handling handshakes. This is the part of the proposal that is novel. This is new, and we're going to be going into this in some detail. And the third part, the third type of form, are the nouns that are derived from those act-on predicates. So the fact that you have forms like close a box with tape, you also have the noun tape. So you have forms that are verbs and forms that are nouns that are related in some way. And sometimes the object and handling handshakes actually show a distinction between a noun and a verb. So here you see a very simple case where you have the toothbrush functioning with being represented with an object handshake, and brush your teeth, the verb, being represented with a handling handshake. Now, all sign languages might not take advantage of all of these different ways to grammatically use handling and object handshakes in this way. But what I'm going to argue here is that it's these kinds of properties, these characteristics, travel together. That's what helps you see how the typological classes are formed. You can take one behavior and then predict some of the others. So my hypothesis is that there are two factors involved in typological membership. One is this very important iconic preference that Padden and colleagues had found, that some sign languages just prefer handling or object handshakes for tools. And then I kind of wanted to articulate clearly what I meant by the second set of characteristics with agentives and with instrumentals and so on. And I'm going to say that it's important to know whether a sign language is instrument sensitive. And that will have an effect on the way that these nouns are produced ultimately, and the way that agentives are produced as well. So if a sign language is instrument sensitive, it will tend to use these object handshakes when there is an instrument argument in the sentence, like close the box with tape or eat the apple with a fork. And that would give us a kind of four-celled schema for different language types. So here we see the noun preference, the handshake preference in nouns. And you could have either a handling handshake preference or an object handshake preference. And you could have two types of sign languages that are both in each of these columns. Some of these that are handling handshake preference are not going to be instrument sensitive, and some of them are. Likewise, some sign languages that are object handshake sensitive are going to be sensitive to instruments, and some are not. So in this way you get this four-way distinction, and I'm going to try to argue that I have data from 4 different sign languages that represents each of these 4 cells. So what I'm going to do is build on Padden's findings by starting with 2 sign languages that she worked on back in 2009, ASL and BSL. We sort of already have an idea of what their preference for handshake is in tools. And see what happens when we walk them through their paces in terms of other kinds of data in the language, of those 3 different types of data that I wanted to look at: the classifier predicates, the act-on verbs, and the nouns derived from act-on verbs. And then once we get a picture of what those 2 sign languages look like, I'm going to bring in 2 new sign languages that we don't know anything about: Hong Kong Sign Language and Italian Sign Language, and see how they behave and what we might have to say about them. And I'm going to try to argue that typology is based not just on iconicity, but on facts about argument structure. So there were 3 tasks that I elicited data, from which I elicited data, and for all of them in these 4 different sign languages, ASL, BSL, Hong Kong Sign Language, and Italian Sign Language. Italian Sign Language is abbreviated LIS, LIS. There were data from 10 native signers. So it was ultimately about 9,000 handshakes that were annotated and analyzed for these results. And they came from 3 tasks. The one was just a verb task, and this is a task that Carol Padden shared with me from her lab, where she had 41 items that were little videos of people interacting with common objects. And it just so happened that some of those objects were instrumenti. They had instruments in vignettes, and some of them were not. Some of them you just interacted with the direct object. And so here you can see what they looked like. So there was like read book, smoke cigar, and then there were a lot of like put on gloves or hat or jacket or jeans, and those were non-instruments. And then you had instrument type, where you had people combing their hair with a comb, eating with a fork, screwing something in with a screwdriver, etc. So here's one. Putting on a hat and combing your hair. And then the second the second task was also Padden's task, where she had slides with the related nouns that went with those act-on verbs, that went with those instrument and non-instrument act-on verbs. Again, 41 items. And so what you saw were things like this: hats and combs. And the data from this task looked something like this. This is a BSL signer, just giving responses to the noun task. And it tells you the low is captioned, so you can see what kind of handshape she's using as she is signing each of the objects. So, you don't need to see it again? Okay? Yeah, okay. So the point being here is that just because you're handling preference language, it doesn't mean that every single object is going to be handling preference. Some of them are going to be object preference too. But this is a BSL signer, one of the signers who ultimately, for all of the items taken together, did have a handling handshake preference. Now for the classifier task, there were 3 different kinds of items, 44 items in all, some of which were just objects in a location, in a particular spatial arrangement. Some of them were objects moving, but not being acted on by a person, so non-agentive. So those 2 are both non-agentive. Statives, and what is called an unaccusative predicate that moves without an agent. And then the third was an agentive case. And so I'm just going to show you a couple of stimuli and then an ASL signer responding to those. So what you saw is for the first two, she used object handshakes, and in the third case, she used both. But crucially, she also included a handling handshake. So now let's take a look at what happened in ASL and BSL and how they behave both with respect to the act-on verbs, the nouns derived from them, and the classifier predicates. And if you're not familiar with sign languages, you might find it somewhat odd that I'm picking as my two opposing sign languages, ASL and BSL, but anybody who's gotten familiar with the sign language world realizes that the British Sign Language and American Sign Language have nothing to do with one another in terms of their historical genealogy, and they're very, very distant in terms of their language families. Okay, so first of all, we replicated Patton's result, and we see that for the instrument nouns, BSL is very handling, it does prefer handling handshakes, and ASL does prefer object handshakes. So at least we know we're getting, the same data. But what's interesting is that this has a consequence for the distinction between nouns and verbs. So here we see the act-on verbs, not the classifier predicates, just the act-on verbs. And we see that both for ASL and BSL, we have a very strong preference for handling handshakes. Now, it's not terribly surprising because all of these act-on verbs are agentive, and so we might expect that. But what the subsequent result of that is that for ASL, nouns of this sort have a preference for using the object handshake, and when it's the verb, you see the preference for the handling handshake. So you actually get a handshake distinction for nouns and verbs in ASL that is sort of interesting, and people haven't observed before. But in a language like BSL, you don't. So future work is going to look to see whether BSL relies more heavily on movement to make the distinction between nouns and verbs, especially in this group of act-on verbs and nouns, because it can't rely at all on the handshake distinction to make the noun-verb distinction. And then we look at the classifier predicates, the ones that I said have this very clear agent, no agent expression via handshake, where object handshakes express no agent clauses and handling handshakes express agentive clauses. And we see that that pattern is super robust. So the blue are the agent handling handshakes, and the brown are the no agent object handshakes. But for this talk, for this work, I'm really interested in the interference cases, where you get the handshake that you didn't expect, and you see little asterisk on top of these bars here, which are no agent clauses, but which have handling handshakes. So it would be as if you had something like, here's the lollipop on the table, instead of the lollipop is on the table like that, which is what you would expect for a non-agentive clause. And if you blow that up, what you see here is there's quite a bit of variability in using object handshakes where you don't expect them in agentive clauses. And I can explain that by, if you remember the example I showed you with the woman showing somebody putting the pen on the table. After she put the pen on the table, she also gave a resultant, what the pen looked like on the table afterwards. And most of these are that. But they were all included here. But it's very rare to get an object handshake, a handling handshake or a no-agent clause. And you see a significant difference between the BSL and the ASL in those types of interfering cases. And it seems that the handshake preference for the instrument nouns is actually interfering here, that is bleeding over a little bit into the no-agent conditions, the no-agent vignettes, and you get handling handshakes where you don't expect them. And so this is another consequence of that iconic preference difference in the two types of languages. So based on nouns, BSL is a handling preference and ASL is an object preference language. This has an effect on the noun-verb distinction, where ASL can make somewhat a noun-verb distinction based on handshake that BSL can't. BSL, we predict, will depend on movement alone, and perhaps will depend more heavily on movement in a certain sense. And then, with respect to the agent-no-agent distinction, we see that in the no-agent context, where we would expect an object handshake, BSL much more often produces a handling handshake than ASL does. So it has this interference. So now let's take a look at two sign languages we don't know very much about and see if they behave like ASL and BSL. So Hong Kong Sign Language and Italian Sign Language. And the first thing we see is that LIS, Italian Sign Language, looks pretty much like ASL, so it seems to have an object preference. And HKSL seems to have a handling preference. So does it follow then that they will have the same issues with the act-on verbs? Well, here are the verbs, the act-on verbs. Remember that both ASL tended to use handling handshakes for the act-on verbs. Here we don't see much of a preference at all. So I started to wonder what would cause this. So I thought, okay, HKSL and LIS are mixed languages, what Patton would have called mixed languages. So how can we figure out why they look mixed? The nouns look right, but now the verbs don't look right. So maybe the key isn't the nouns at all. Maybe we need to back up and look at the lexical semantics of the verb. And here we see the same agent, no agent distinction, gigantic blue bars, handling handshakes and agentive clauses, giant brown bars, object handshakes and no agent clauses, and we don't see too much going on